What's up, world? This is Maxwell 3000 production. I am Maxwell 3000. I'm back again with another edition of Book Club with my big bro, Tommy Dixon. What's up, Tommy? How are you, sir?
Good, bro. How you doing this morning?
I am well. I am well. I'm really excited about the author and the book that we're doing this edition. We reviewed Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And I, over the years, have really become enamored with Zora Neale Hurston. She is a somewhat, or maybe a very much obscure author and scholar of the 20th century, but also somebody that made some really big contributions to both the academic world and the art of the novel and the short story for that matter. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about Zora Neale Hurston. So I appreciate that, Tommy. I know that you kind of sparked us off doing this thing, so I wanted to say that. Zora Neale Hurston was born January 7th, 1891. She died at 69, January 28th, 1960. Now, she was born in Nottazula, Alabama, um, but she grew up in Eatonville, Florida. And many times, Miss Hurston would refer as Eatonville as where she was born, was not a fact, but it was certainly her hometown. Uh, Eatonville was one of the first all black communities in northern Florida. Zora Neale Hurston's father was a sharecropper and a Baptist preacher, and her mother was an educator. She taught elementary school. And so they moved to Eatonville, basically to be a part of this emerging community of black folks. Um, and Zora's father actually becomes mayor of Eatonville later on down the line, which, from our readings, we kind of know that Eatonville becomes a central part of Zora Neale Hurston's writings. And kind of with that in some context, we can kind of see maybe some characters in that after we get into it a little bit. Um, After Zora's mother died when she was fairly young, and very quickly after her mother passed, her father marries another woman, and there was some controversy in the community regarding whether the two had had an extramarital affair before the passing of Zora's mother. Regardless, not long after that, her father sends her to Jacksonville to a boarding school. And so she's getting her early education, and her father stops paying the bill, stops paying her school fees. And so she's expelled from school for not paying her fees. And it's at this point in Zora's life that we really don't know a whole lot about her. She kind of begins working as a maid or a domestic, goes up to Atlanta, I think, for a little while and is working around there. But we don't really hear much about her until 1917, where she begins attending then Morgan Academy, which is now Morgan State University, a prominent HBCU in Baltimore, Maryland. Um, and she really lied about her age then, saying that she was much younger so that she could go to high school for free. And she finished up her high school work in that year of 1917. And then in 1918, she goes on to Howard University in Washington. And it's there that she really starts to explode as far as a writer, or starts to emerge in her own self. She helps start the Hilltop, which is the school paper, and she is accepted into the Alan Locke Literary Club, known as the Stylist. And I say that because Alan Locke is a pretty pretty prominent figure in literature. He was known as the first black Rhodes Scholar. And so to be accepted into his literary club was a pretty big deal for Zora. And she ends up getting a scholarship in 1925 to go to Columbia University in New York. And her explosion just continues. It is there that she begins in anthropology. And she earns a fellowship from this guy, Frank Boas, who is like the father of ethnography in some sense, but a really prominent figure in anthropology in the early 20th century, and very highly regarded now as really one of the fathers of the discipline. And she begins her academic research and is really a pioneer in this idea of ethnographic studies. And she begins to go to the deep South, where she was raised to collect folk stories and songs and to kind of document the culture of the people living there in the time. And she was really one of the first kind of African American scholars, so to speak. And I know I'm starting to nerd out, but I just really, before we get into the art of Zora Neale Hurston, I just really want to acknowledge her and admire her as a scholar and an academic, and really the pioneering work that she did in anthropology. And how that ties into her artwork is a lot of her novels and short stories were based on her research. What we find in this book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, comes directly not only from her life experiences, but from the academic research that she conducted during that time. And so I could spend a whole lot of time talking about Zora Neale Hurston, but as an artist, really have to say that she continued to push the boundaries of prose and of the form as far as the novel. While she was at Columbia University, she began to be involved in the Harlem Renaissance, and really found a lot of success early on, both as an academic and as an artist. Now, she was not without controversy. She wrote a play with Langston Hughes, and then kind of just ran off on old Langston and sold the rights finished it up and sold the rights on her own. She was sometimes accused of being out of touch with the black population because she spoke out against government assistance, and she had strong feelings, and she felt like she didn't think folks ought to be dependent on government assistance because it would lead to a possibility of fascism or even worse, communism, as she said it. So she was a really strong individualist. I think it comes out in her work, and just does a masterful job of combining the academic work that she did with her artistry. And I'm going to shut up about Zora Neale Hurston because I just really love her, and I'm just really glad we're doing this. And like I said, we reviewed Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's interesting enough, I once heard Oprah say on CBS Mornings that this was her favorite book. Not that that really holds any kind of weight for me in what we should read. And I love Oprah and everything, don't get me wrong. But we might not like the same books. But it's interesting that this book kind of touches me in that way, and then it's a broad spectrum of who can relate to this book. So Tommy, go ahead, tell us a little bit about the plot and summarize Their Eyes Were Watching God for us.
So, Their Eyes Were Watching God is basically a love story. That's one way you could describe it. There's at least that element in the story. It's you could also describe it as maybe a coming of age tale for this young woman. I saw that in one of the critical reviews, it was referred to as a story about her evolving selfhood, which I thought was a really good way to put it. Uh, the story is centered around this character, Janie, who is she's a light-skinned woman living in this black community in North Florida, raised by her grandmother, who is a former slave. And a lot of the way she was taught to think, behave, and live was heavily influenced by that grandmother. And you can imagine grandmother's perspectives were influenced by everything that she had been through in her lifetime, which
including being raped by her owner that precipitated in the birth of Janie's mother, our character's mother, right?
right, right.
Yeah.
So she's kind of as a lot of other characters that we've read about over these last several months, in a way, she's kind of an outcast. Not that she's necessarily treated poorly, but just because she looks a little different from most of her peers, she is viewed differently too. And I think with some of that, we've studied that looking different, being treated different makes a person sometimes think different and feel different. But that's a whole another thing. But I guess it plays into the plot somewhat. So the story follows her, like I said, coming of age, her life through a few different relationships, three marriages, I believe it was, throughout the story, and different scenarios as far as being the stay-at-home housewife, and
Feminine archetypes.
exactly. It addresses the societal pressures of the female's role in the household, in the community, and things like that. And Janie is not necessarily satisfied with the life. She has this longing to see what else is out there in the world besides this small piece of it that she's been privy to. So I think it was like a search for the horizon. She wants to know, she wants to see the horizon and not just like visually, but she wants to experience life, beyond what's in her local community. So through that, she lives in very different scenarios with her different partners and experiences a lot of different economical situations and gets to see a lot of different parts of the state of Florida. It's a lot different in North Florida than what it is when she goes down to the Glades, which is where a good part of the story takes place. Um, and throughout the story, she grows into a woman, and her values and perspectives and just views on life change. And you see she gets to decide what's really important, what's really valuable to her, and gets an opportunity to live life on her terms, more so than she ever would have if she hadn't left the small town where she grew up. So it's a pretty interesting story, and it makes you think about how different times. For one, makes me think about how different times were back then. Uh, Women that we know from our lives now today, man, not going for a lot of stuff that the women had to endure at this time. And I'd say it's a fairly historical representation of the life and times of that period. So uh, it's a pretty entertaining read. It's a lot different than things we've read in the past, I guess primarily just because it's female perspective. This is our first book I think that we've reviewed. Not the first that we've read, I know, but it's comes from an entirely female perspective, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and she really does a whole lot with this piece. And you talked about dreams on the horizon, and you got that whether you realize it or not, right? That was her. That came from her opening line, right?
Oh,
As when she talks about men's dreams are like ships on the horizon, right?
yeah.
And just as a book, it's not most of the storyline. It does pertain to this woman, Janie's love life and her development, and from this
Hmm.
feminist or not feminist perspective, but from the feminine perspective. Um, but just on her use of the English language in a technical sense, right?
Yeah.
She uses such beautiful language, and then almost immediately she goes into this local vernacular and dialect in her prose, which was very new to do it to this extent from the not just the black perspective, but the southern black perspective, right? As much as we celebrate the Harlem Renaissance and the folks that we think about with the Harlem Renaissance, some of what their ideas was that there was a black vanguard class that was above or better than this southern sharecropper. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, Zora presents this community, and I think it's certainly historically accurate. We say so because of her academic research, right? That's how we can say we believe this is historically accurate. And the terms that she uses were contemporary terms, but that was new to display black culture in that way. And also, at the time, we think about when was this written? Do we remember 1934, some
I can't say for
37?
sure. I think 37 is what I have in mind, but not positive. I have to check.
1930s, right?
Yeah.
To be presenting a lot of black artists and black scholars were presenting pieces to be accepted by this white academia, this white audience, right? Um,
Hmm.
Dora was writing for the black audience, and not to say that we have to live up to anything else, but just because this is what it is, and there is value in these people, this group of everyday, mostly uneducated from a kind of northern academic standpoint, right? But they have a different kind of knowledge, like we talk about a lot, right? And she just presents it so authentically, maybe
Right.
for me,
Right. And
right?
what my bro was saying by that is, if you're not familiar with prose and things like that, in the reading, she writes the conversations between the characters phonetically. All the spelling is phonetic. Like you have to have an open mind whenever you go to read this, or you might not understand what they're trying to say at first.
Oh, and some
it took
things
a
I
little
had to read
time to
twice.
yeah, it took a little time to adjust to understand. Okay, what is that sentence supposed to say? Like, did I just misread this and I read again? No, that's actually what it says. But she's writing it in the way that the people spoke in that time and place.
Which
And
is why we piggyback off of London, right? Because that's something that we identified that London did so well, and then when we said, hey, Hurston really does this well,
yeah, she
right?
takes it to another level.
To another level, right? She
Yeah.
does. And so it's the back and forth from her technical writing, which is also beautiful, and she creates
Mhm.
complex metaphors and allegories.
Yeah,
But then,
almost poetic, as far as that
yeah,
goes. I mean, it's beautiful. Yeah,
and then switches back to that phonetic prose type style just seamlessly,
yeah.
right? And that may be something that's done more now in the 21st century, but
Hmm.
almost, well, 90 years ago it didn't happen as much, right? Particularly from a young black woman's perspective, you know what I mean? So I just really think she's courageous in doing that. um, and also, she kind of pushes the First Amendment, right to speech, censorship. You know, we see some foul words in London and Steinbeck and Hemingway and folks like that, but she uses her use of the N word was not common or not seemed acceptable at the time, and she got some backlash for that. But she said, "Hey, this is how people talk," you
Right.
know. Um, so just beautiful and amazing, and really speaks on a lot of things, like we said before, even with her grandmother and that perspective of growing up in slavery and then coming out of that, and what that transition was like with her, and like you mentioned, her worldview versus Janie's worldview. You know,
Like we refer to in different books we've reviewed, we refer to everyone's idea of the American dream. And those two characters are a good example of how much different one person's can be from another. Everyone's is different. And
yes,
her grandmother, having been a slave, her idea of the perfect life, a good life, the dream, was way different than Janie's idea.
yeah,
Who had never
yeah.
experienced that same lifestyle. You know, I mean, Janie wasn't ready to settle for the same things that made her grandmother content.
Right. And yeah, just and it almost, thinking about it right now, if you put Maslow's hierarchy of needs next to that, right? It follows the flow, right?
Right.
And I don't want to get too much into the book. I don't want to give it away. We want to encourage people to read it.
Yeah.
It is a great love story. In the end, with their final husband, Tea Cake, and she goes through a lot of not just the evolution from her grandmother's perspective, but like you said, as she grows as a woman and through these different relationships, an early husband who's leaving an abusive relationship to go to another relationship, and then being in that relationship until that person passes on, and that whole story, and then kind of moving on from that. Um, and like you mentioned, through the whole thing is highlighting the individual. And I think that's what Zora would have wanted us to say, right? And not her as a woman, not her as a black woman, not her as a light-skinned black woman, but her as Janie. You know what I mean? And I think that's what Zora would have wanted. Um, so I'm gonna kind of shut us down because I feel like I'm gonna nerd out and go crazy about Miss Hurston again. So please give me your critique, your review, and kind of closing comments on Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Okay, well, one thing I like to mention is that when I first read the title, Their Eyes Were Watching God, I wondered, is it about religion or something like that? And it's not. That's not the way that phrase is used. Not this reference. It kind of reminds me of how people will say nowadays. You might hear somebody, "Man, look what God did." You know, that's kind of a common expression that you hear a lot of times. They were standing in awe of something that they're seeing whenever that phrase is used in the book. It's kind of a natural wonder or a disaster, maybe something like that. But Miss Hurston, as an artist, and all these authors are artists, and we appreciate and respect them for their work. Um, she's masterful, and we've used that term before, but in comparison to some of the gentlemen who we've studied already, these past several months, she's sitting at the top of the class. I'm not saying she is the very best, but she's up there with the best, though, as far as skills, um, the writing. She was she was a real talent, and and not just talent. She put a lot of work into this too, and it really shows. It's a good read. The story flows good. You have to give it a chapter to get into the the vernacular, the prose that she's using, so you can really understand some of the conversations that are going on. But once it gets going, it's a good story. You can get through it pretty easily. It's not a really big book, less than a couple hundred pages, I think. A person could read this in a couple settings, I think, fairly easily.
Yeah, and you know, we can go on and on about Miss Hurston, and she had a lot of success um, during the 30s and the 40s, but then she kind of fell into obscurity, and there's some other different reasons because of that. Um, we could maybe be critical of her for not making the best financial decisions, but she also lived a very free life and an individual's life. Um, it's sad that she is as obscure as she is. I feel like maybe in the last 20 years or so, there has been a resurgence of interest in Hurston and her work, and that is great. Um, because, like you, man, she is float. It's hard for me to say she's my favorite. Um, but I have dove into her on both sides, on the academic side and on the fiction side, and just as a person, as far as how she lived her life, and she is a great inspiration. Um, and as far as the book, I would agree with you. I guess if I was going to be critical, some of the plot lines wrap up a little too neatly. But I think as far as it is a complete fictional artistic expression combined with ethnographic research, combined with philosophical insight, combined with this historical narrative. We didn't even get to the actual historical event that this story ends up being also based around. So there's just so many layers of excellence in it. So I would certainly recommend the book as an introduction to Hurston, and then Hurston as an author to kind of for folks to kind of learn about further. For sure, for sure. All right, so tell the people. Well, first of all, let's just say it again, just once and for all. If you see a copy of something that Zora Neale Hurston wrote, pick it up and read it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I'd say that's a good idea, and when you get done, you'll be better off for it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, tell the people what we got coming up next.
Okay. The next book that we're going to review, we've already started reading, is called A Farewell to Arms. It's Ernest Hemingway. It's a very popular, well-known, I guess, famous even novel. It's basically a love story based in Europe, World War One. Uh, very interesting, very highly acclaimed novel. I'm really looking forward to getting through it. It's already started off pretty good, and from what I've learned about Hemingway, he's a very interesting character as well. Lived quite a life, kind of a man's man, for lack of a better way to put it, a macho man. Uh, so yeah,
And yet we're reading a love story.
right, right. A
Yeah.
farewell to arms.
A Farewell to Arms. A lot of people say it's his best work in the novel. There might be some that say it's the best work of any novel. I wouldn't necessarily say that part. I don't know that I'd say either one of them. I'm a big fan of Hemingway. Obviously, he's known for his short stories and stuff like that, and that's partly what got me into him at a younger age. But yeah, a great read. Getting into it now, I just love being immersed in Hemingway's world that he creates. Um, and Looking forward to the review. All right, bro. Well, I appreciate this again. You got any closing thoughts or anything else we need to add?
I think I just wanted to go back to their eyes were watching God with like a final thought on that for me was like it's kind of inspirational for that that search for your American dream. You know, don't just cruise through life, man. Get out and see what the world has to offer, you know, and find out what your real dream is. You know, what would it really be? What's really out there that could give you that sense of fulfillment, you know, for your lifetime. I think that's a kind of a like a key takeaway for me from reading this. So if that's the kind of thing that interests you, you should pick up a copy.
Man, and that's some real talk from Tommy Dixon. This has been Maxwell 3000 production. I am Maxwell 3000. Peace and love.